80. Conscious awareness is not bound by the body or brain, so the assumption that it fundamentally comes into being upon birth and growth and is entirely annihilated upon death is necessarily false. And I think that this is a good sentence because a couple sentences because it provides an alternative from thinking that there's emptiness, something emptiness, right? It kind of now we shift the perspective into the fact that, well, if consciousness and awareness is not singularly defined by the finite existence of reality, that then what we can perceive, then what is it? What's outside of that? So could you touch on that a little bit?
Yes. So, right. The, as we were saying, the idea that consciousness is bound and totally comes out of material is part of the theory of material emergent evolution. And that's completely upended by the proofs that we talked about last time. So, because consciousness is something that um, exceeds the bounds of the body, the material substance, then at least as far as this strong case is concerned, where you say void or annihilation, life back to annihilation, that has to be uh, thrown out, and we have to be working with something else. So but we can't go all the way to the other end yet in terms of logical proof and evidence to say, therefore, you have a soul or an etheric body or whatever, and that goes off to the special place. And yeah, none of that is necessarily uh, proven by any of the preceding evidence or discussion. So then we have to face this question of, well, we've talked about how consciousness is not emergent and secondary, but what is actually conscious? And through the book, I talk about um, like it's clearly the case that we develop as individuals with individual personality traits and characteristics that are connected to bodily experiences and again seem to be connected to particular structures of our brain. So if we leave behind a body and a brain, then it seems very well possible that those things are indeed lost. And that is still potentially uh, a considerable loss and tragedy. So we're not out of the woods yet, per se.
So if we're looking at infinite consciousness, because I want to start pulling this back a little bit. Okay, so Jung talks about archetypes. He talks about embodying different personas. Uh, and then we have our identity. We have our ego. I'm Stephen, you're Rob. I'm a man, you're a man. You
Hmm.
have these eyes, I have breaking down what our identity is. That is that what we give up upon death? Is
Right.
then do we then peel back into another layer of consciousness and awareness, and then we are we have this anxiety in our lives of not willing or wanting to relinquish or to give this persona, this identity up, this I am. So what then is that consciousness or that awareness that is behind the perception of our identity?
Right, right. So those are the exact questions to be asking, and those are the questions that I'm get into in this chapter. Um, and it's important, I would say, to be um, consistent with terminology. You don't necessarily have to use the words in the same way everyone else does, but then if you're trying to construct a layered theory of identity and consciousness, just make sure you're trying to keep it straight in your mind. So, for example, some people might not say the ego is the identity. Some people might say it is. either way, just be consistent and try and picture this stacked perception. Um, but as you pointed out, and this is something that is fairly well known, at least within the circles of, let's say, general spirituality, mindfulness, meditation to some degree, is that you can transcend, even in this life, you can transcend levels of what you thought was your own identity. And then you can look back on that and be like, wow, I was totally wrapped up in that, living that out, but that actually doesn't doesn't touch the real me, is one way of thinking of it. And like you were saying, so you can pull back, and you don't need to relegate that process to death. You can experience that during a lifetime, you can, of that pulling back of a layer. Um, so that naturally raises the question of how far that process goes, and maybe the analogous process upon death. And it does bring with it anxieties and difficulties, and because there's attachments, and you can all you can sit around and very nicely say, oh yes, that's all illusion and Maya, and we're actually above all that, and we just need to let go of it. And that's wonderful high language, but I think everyone who goes through the process knows that it's not at all easy, and that it is genuinely scary and uncomfortable and difficult. And we fail and we forget and we relapse and etc. So these attachments are not just things that you um, get you send away by um, saying that, oh, I'm beyond that. It's actually an embodied process, ironically, to some degree, of transformation. Um, so, so yeah, that makes it a much more complicated issue, and a more difficult one. But it still opens up the door to that idea of perhaps, even if everything that you had accumulated and become accustomed to as your essential self, even if all of that is lost, it's possible that that was actually never really you.